In chapter 13 of Matthew, Jesus tells the parable of the mustard seed. He says the kingdom of heaven is like this teeny tiny little seed that grows into this great, big, huge plant. A man went and put it in this field. So it's the smallest of the seeds, but yet when it grows, it's one of the largest in all of the garden. And then it becomes a tree where the birds can come and make their home. In chapter 14, Jesus illustrates what a tiny little seed of faith can actually do. Chapter 14, that starts with the death of Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. Now, Herod is the corrupt Jewish leader at that time, and he's sort of in the pocket of the Roman Empire. Herod, at this point, you might be reading it and get a little confused, but Herod is confusing John the Baptist with Jesus. Both of them were amazing preachers who were going and sort of calling out the empires, the authorities of this world, that authority that Herod was sort of part of. And so both of them are talking about the kingdom of God, and so Herod sort of gets Jesus and John the Baptist confused. Herod assumed that when word of Jesus got to him, that John had been dead for such a long time and that John must have been resurrected. And it's important for us to kind of note this part in chapter 14 because it's sort of a foreshadowing of what will eventually sort of happen to Jesus. When Jesus hears of John, his cousin's death, he's overwhelmed. And he's justifiably sort of trying to get some time to himself, some time to sort of grieve. And so what he does is he withdraws from the crowds that he's been healing and teaching, and he gets into a boat so he can get some time to himself. But the truth is the crowds, they won't relent. Instead, they're running alongside the sea. They're trying to get Jesus' attention, like, hey, hey, hey. And finally, Jesus lands the boat. And when he sees the crowd gathered on them, he has compassion on them. I want to pay attention a little bit to this word compassion. Now, in the original Greek, the word is actually splachnizomai. It's this really fun word to say. You should practice it at home. Splachnizomai. It's where we actually get our modern word for spleen. This word compassion, it actually means to have your guts poured out. The kind of compassion that's not just sort of thoughts and prayers, but the kind of compassion that is absolutely moved directly to action. That's a different kind of compassion that Jesus has on this entire crowd gathered there. Now, this word, splachnizomai, this compassion, it's actually used only 12 times in all of the Bible. He has compassion on them. This moving compassion. He puts alongside his own needs to grieve his cousin, and he leans into the needs of the crowd. He's teaching and he's healing this crowd. And then all of a sudden it gets to the point where it's late and it's time for them to eat dinner. And we have the story of the feeding of 5,000. But when you read it, it just says 5,000 men, but there was probably added women and children. So really it's more likely 20,000 people that Jesus is going to feed. The disciples, they doubt how Jesus is going to possibly make this happen. But with just a little mustard seed of faith, you'll see there enough to feed all the people, and then there are leftovers. Friends, that is how God's abundance works. A mustard seed to a great big tree, a little bit of faith to the feeding of the 20,000 people. After all are fed, Jesus sends his disciples on a boat, and he sends out the crowd. It's time for them to sort of go their own ways. And then Jesus takes a moment for himself by walking on the water towards the boat. Peter gets out, and he's so bold as to ask to walk towards Jesus. But then after a moment, he doubts. The little faith of mustard seed must have been gone from him at that moment, and he sinks. Jesus rescues him, and the two of them get into the boat. All the disciples, they have their faith increased. Maybe that mustard seed grows to like a slightly larger seed. And then they start to understand that Jesus is the Son of God. The last part of this chapter is so very important. It goes with the rest. Jesus and his disciples are all the way across the sea in the city of Gennesaret. And in that place, all the people who were sick, they just wanted to touch the fringe of Jesus' cloak. These are people who are outside of the faith, who just have this mustard seed faith to just touch the fringe of Jesus' cloak so that they can be healed. Friends, this is a beautiful chapter. I hope that you enjoy it. Here's our questions for today. Number 1, when in your life has your faith felt little tiny, like a little mustard seed? And number 2, What do you think the author of Matthew is trying to prove when he talks about how those outside of the Jewish faith, outside of Jesus' circle, actually experience these deep faith? And why do you think is that significant and a point to be made?